See, once upon a time, there was a man who had everything that most men would think they need in order to be happy. You know, he had the nice house, the nice car, the dog, and he had all the things inside his house that most people think they need to be happy. But something eluded this man, because still there was something missing in his life. And he felt, after looking around for a while, that it was time to go see the great healer in his town. Okay? Because the healer was a wise old person who had advised many in the past and helped them to find their own happiness. So he went along one day to see the healer, and he arrived for his appointment. And the healer looked at him and he said, "Well, I think I can help you. But the remedy that I suggest is none that you're going to find at the local pharmacy. Because in order for you to find the happiness that you say you're looking for, you need to go off on a little pilgrimage." All right? So the man was a bit dubious, and he thought, well, okay, if it's the healer that suggests it, I'll do it. The healer says, what you need to do is you need to go off and you need to find the happiest man in the world. And when you find the happiest man in the world, you need to ask him for his shirt, and you need to put on that shirt. And then you will know what it means to be happy. Okay, so our seeker locks his door, gives the dog to the neighbor, parks his car in the garage, and he sets off on his pilgrimage. Okay, so he's going around interviewing people throughout town. And, you know, he meets happy people, but surely not the happiest man in the world. So he goes to the next town and the next town. And he's interviewing many people over days and weeks turn into months. And he's traveling far and wide. He's gone off to other lands already. And months turn into years, and he's still on the road, interviewing many thought to be happy people. And he keeps getting the same kind of answer. I am happy, but there is still one happier than I. And his search continued until one day he arrived at the outskirts of a dense forest. And he knew he'd arrived at the right place at the right time, because there were gales of laughter fuming from within the forest. And it even seemed as if the trees themselves were sort of dancing to this kind of laughter, and the flowers were smiling to these waves of laughter that were echoing from within the forest. And he got that feeling that finally he was nearing his destination. So he entered into that thick, dark forest and followed the sounds toward the source of the laughter. And he had to make his way through the forest. It was really thick shrubbery. At times he needed to get bushes out of the way and squeeze himself between trees, and he had to be careful to avoid bark burn. Have you heard of bark burn before? Bark burn is when we forget about the forest and become a little bit too intimate with the trees. Bark burn is when we lose our view over things and get a little bit too attached to the objects within a certain form. And we rub ourselves up against those trees and it scratches us, burns the skin. He had to be really careful as he made his way through the thick forest. But he followed that sound and he followed that good feeling until he came to a glade, an opening right there in the middle of the forest. And way off in the center of this glade, he noticed something very, very interesting. So I'd be curious. Any ideas what a meta is for? What is a metaphor?
Story going into above and beyond the reality, creating different reality.
Okay. Going above and beyond reality to create a different reality.
It's a model.
It's a model. Representation. Life is a metaphor, I'd suggest. Our experience of it, anyway. Because it's not the reality. It's a map. The map is never the reality. So our subjective experience of each passing moment is a metaphor. And that metaphor controls our life. In fact, whatever I say after the phrase I am is just a metaphor. I am Jevon. What is that? It's an internal representation. Yours is not the same as mine. That is a table. Really? What's it made of? What does it mean? So we have a relationship with it, and that metaphor then has a certain meaning, and that's how I can make use of it. But in the context of using metaphor therapeutically or in a coaching type context, metaphors are stories that we use to help ourselves or clients transcend their current ways of experiencing themselves or their reality in order to have a new experience. And like the metaphors that we've just been referring to, this type of story metaphor enables them to bridge their awareness to new perceptions because it works directly with the unconscious. The mind is a metaphor. In fact, Gregory Bateson had a lot to say about metaphor. He says, "We can never definitely know anything about external reality. The best we can do is seek more and more workable metaphors for it." So we can update our maps of reality until the maps that we're running on are providing us with the fulfillment, happiness, joy, and results that we'd like to have in life. The metaphor is not the same logical type as the idea it represents. We learned about logical levels of abstraction yesterday in the facilitating wheel. So the metaphor is a deeper level of abstraction than the thing it's trying to represent. A metaphor can point to an idea, but can never be the idea. The map is not the territory. Bateson goes on, because metaphor is indirect, multidimensional, and multi-meaningful, it's a communication form that incorporates some randomness. So there's interpretation going on all the time of what metaphors, as in stories, mean. And because we know that people will interpret it, we utilize these stories in a way that their interpretation is bound to be one that is useful to them. We can never be sure of it, but we'll certainly be selective in our use of stories so that the way in which they probably are going to interpret it will have meaning and value to them. Stories are how the mind connects individual bits of data. Each person has their own central metaphor. I am, whatever I label myself as. Telling stories is a natural technique for evoking resources in clients. The indirectness of metaphors allows clients to try out a new perceptual frame without having to decide consciously whether to accept or reject it. The wonders of metaphor made their way into the NLP curriculum because metaphor was just about the only thing Erickson did in the second half of his career. He just told stories, and stories within stories, and stories within stories within stories, called multiple embedded metaphor. And eventually I can tell you a story within a story within a story, and you're going to wonder why I haven't ended these stories and I'm starting the next one. And it would be a good thing to wander deeply into the unconscious about the meanings of things and how stories can help you to have new experiences about things that you've never experienced before in wonderful and colorful ways that can surprise and delight you in days, weeks, and months to come. So they don't have to make sense, but they can sound good, don't they? But you know, once upon a time, there was a bird in a cage. And this particular caged bird lived on a windowsill where it had a wonderful view of the great outdoors. And every day it observed other birds, real birds that could fly, coming and going, landing in the trees and doing what birds do. It was the flying part that particularly intrigued the caged bird. And it longed to know, what would it be like to spread my wings and just be free, to be a bird? And then after that little state wore off, thoughts would come in, yes, but it's safe to be here in my cage, and my owner cleans my cage every day, brings me fresh water and food. I don't have to go hunting for those things. I see those birds outside in winter and they're all sort of looking for shelter, and it's cold and I'm nice and cozy and warm. It's a good cage, it's a good cage. But every day, those birds outside would fly free, and something itched inside the caged bird, and it longed to be a bird, to spread its wings. Now one day, the owner had been cleaning the cage, and he'd been cleaning his apartment. And it just so happened that he was very busy and got a bit clumsy, and he forgot to close the window of the apartment, and simultaneous to that, he'd forgotten to close the cage door. And the bird saw this opportunity. Its door was open. The window was open. The birds outside were flying free. And so could he. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that it most probably never have again. To be a bird, to spread its wings, to at last have the experience that it longed to have. But, and the owner was coming back into the room, and the owner was just about to discover that the window was open and the door was open, and the owner was about to take immediate action to do something about it, and the bird knew that this was the last chance. This was its very last chance to finally do something, to finally do something. So it just decided. So a metaphor can be thought of as an isomorphic bridge. Isos is a Greek word for sameness. Morph means to change. So there's something about sameness and change in the word isomorphic. And what metaphors do is they build a bridge in the therapeutic coaching facilitating context. They build a bridge that enables the client to shift at the unconscious level from their present state, the issue that they bring for the session, through to their desired state. No other intervention, no other swish, which would be a wonderful metaphoric process as well, but just through storytelling. I quite like Lange's point here. Metaphor paints a picture with words, combining and integrating non-linear imaginal communication with linear verbal communication. And so we tell a story that is meaningful and pertinent and relevant for the client. And I love to tell stories in sessions with clients. I do have a repertoire of favorite stories. And since Erickson did it, I thought I'd try it out. Change the story, change the emphasis, change the characters. Combine different stories for different clients in different situations. I use them mainly in training situations like this. And very often with clients, I try to create a new story anecdotal example of something that I think will have relevance to them. And it's fun to work in that way with clients, and it has meaning and value to them. And it's ecological because it is enabling the client to find their own best answers. Now, one way in which stories work well is when we take it to a threshold like that one you've just experienced. This is where we don't end the story. We offer the listener the opportunity to end the story themselves. What happened then? What happened? But the threshold is sort of towards an inevitable outcome, and we know which inevitable outcome we'd like that client to make out of it. All right? But it doesn't necessarily tell them how it's going to end. And it shouldn't, because then it's over. And they don't take ownership of it, because they didn't end it themselves. Okay. So if you're ever going to use metaphor as an intervention, then there's some things about the present state that you want to elicit. The present state, typical things, is you want to know what triggers their problem. You want to know what behavior that is that they then do. What is the unwanted reaction? What state does it put them in? And once you've got that information, you also want to find out about what they want instead. That must be positively stated. It must provide them with a good feeling and resourceful behaviors. So you want to make sure that they're expressing all of those things. If they're not expressing what they want and they're still talking about what they don't want, then it's not a desired outcome. It's just another description of what they don't want. So we just pay careful attention. Are we eliciting an issue, or are we eliciting an outcome? An outcome is always positively stated. It's got a positive feeling to it, and resourceful behaviors associated with that. And positive, I don't really mean your client should always have a wonderful, optimistic, happy outcome. It doesn't have to be anything like that, but it should certainly not be motivated by what they don't want. So when they talk about safety and security from what? So a towards, or at least a neutral term that describes what they would like. If you're ever going to create a fresh metaphoric story for somebody in this type of a situation, you need to have some information about them. You need to know something about their likes and preferences, their religious beliefs, their education, where they've lived, what their favorite holiday was that they've ever had. Might be nice to pick up on some of those positive memories. Their hobbies, their likes, their dislikes, their favorite things, their least favorite things. And these are generally things you become aware of in some of the very first conversations you ever have with a client. And maybe it's a client you're only ever going to have one session with. So, get to know them a little bit before you decide to intervene in any way. So you want to use terms that enable the client to associate into your story. And that's called the as-if frame in NLP. You help the client to have an experience as if it is happening now, through using all the representational systems: visual, auditory, gustatory, olfactory, and kinesthetic. A charismatic story uses all these representational systems because it makes it vivid and present for the client. It also uses the full range of chunk sizes, from focus in on details through to abstract. Think about the hierarchy of ideas. Now, if I'm going to use a story in a healing context, then it depends once again on the client. Would a fairy tale type story starting with once upon a time be useful? Or would a story that is more relative to some recent news, sport, real life be more useful to the client? But the point is that you want your story to not be immediately identified by their conscious mind as obvious. I know exactly what you're up to and where you're going with all of this. Oh. So it needs to be abstract enough for them to not consciously get bored by the idea of listening to your story, but to create intrigue. And if you get too fantastical and they're just not into that type of a thing, then you lose them, loses rapport. They're not receptive to the message of your story. Then there is a wonderful methodology that would really be perfectly compatible with our ASE approach, which is how to identify through the words that clients use to describe their challenges, a way of deeply respecting the metaphors that they use to describe their problems and remaining in the realm of that metaphor and repeating back their words and then extending it so that those metaphors could evolve and metamorphosize and through that eventually change. And when the metaphor changes, so does our experience of it. The client says, my stomach is in such a knot. The practitioner's response would be, and when there is such a knot, repeating back the client's words and gestures, what kind of a knot is that knot? And so it forces the client to simply explore the metaphor that they're using more in depth. And the response might be, well, it's like a tightness in the pit of my stomach. And the practitioner's response would be, and what kind of a tightness is that in the pit of your stomach? And that's the technique. It just keeps on following the client. So I feel like I'm hitting my head against the wall. And what kind of a wall is that wall that you keep hitting your head against? Well, it's like a big red brick wall. And how big and red is that big red brick wall? It just helps them to identify the metaphors. Because usually when you say, I feel like I've got my head in the clouds, you don't literally have a picture of your head in clouds. But the practitioner would say, and what kind of clouds are those in which your head is? Like, well, you know, they're these really thick grey storm clouds. And what's it like to have your head in really thick grey storm clouds? And the expectation is that through exploring with the client deeper and deeper into the metaphor, going into it, and by default you'll be going into all the submodality distinctions of it, that they start to realize what constitutes the metaphors. And eventually those clouds part and those brick walls fall down and those knots unravel as a result of it. And clients experience healing, greater levels of resourcefulness. And this methodology is called symbolic modeling. And there's a book, its subtitle is by that name. The main title is called Metaphors in Mind. And it's all about symbolic modeling. On Saturday, I will be introducing you to more about metaphor, Erickson's use thereof. But Erickson did say, and it's one of his principles of being a good Ericksonian hypnotist, that you should close some of your loops. And so, you know, when I've told a story and intentionally not finished it, it's for a good reason. Why would I tell a story and at some crucial point end and carry on with something else? What has happened? What has been your experience so far? There have been a couple that I've opened and left. That's called an open loop. Why have I left open loops in the middle of a training? And now we're in the metaphor section, and I'm willing to reveal that secret.
Makes the lesson important school.
Yeah, I think so.
Your unconscious mind alert to just waiting and absorbing a lot more.
Waiting and absorbing. Yes, you're on the right track.
Become a co-creator.
You're in the process of co-creating what happens next in the story. Yes, and you're in that process all the time while the loop is open. And while you're in the process of co-creating, that's exactly a good process to be in while you're at a training course of this kind. But there's something about the points and what was going on in those stories that I've left open so far. There's the great big cave, and something's about to happen. There's the happiest man on his journey, and something's about to happen.
Could you kind of take us right up to the threshold?
Yeah, well, unlike this type of story where, the caged bird, something's about to happen, but that one's up to you. I'm not going to tell you what happened to the caged bird. You need to finish that one for yourself. But I will eventually tell you about the cave and the happiest man. And the happiest man I'll tell you in a moment. But the cave you'll have to wait till the end of the training, because that's a loop I'm keeping up the whole training. So there's certain loops I open on day 1 of the course, and if you ever do trainers training, this will be revealed. And it's for the following reason. When something's about to happen, we tend to sort of sit up straight or move closer to the edge of our seats. Loosely speaking. We listen closely. What? What? What's about to happen? What's happening? What's going on? And what happens next? And as a trainer, it's useful to get your audience into that type of a state of curiosity. They want more. So it just enables you to be in a learning state. I want to know more. I'm curious. And school teachers should know about that type of utilization and do it in classrooms. Because we'd all like our pupils to be ready to learn, wanting to learn, as opposed to bored. So we set that up. And I've set up one at the start of the course, and I'll close it. I'll be kind. I'll close that one at the end of the course. There'll be others that I might not close, because I think there's something useful about sometimes going through life with that wanton curiosity of, what else is there? There are a number of stories I'll be telling over the weekend that are designed for that purpose, and I'm warning you now. I will not be closing all of those loops, because for the same reason Erickson left them open, we'll be leaving them open. I don't know how they end. Those stories have no ending. That's how they end. That's how Erickson left them. And they're brilliant. And they're in the book. My voice will go with you. Because open loops leave us open and receptive. However, when there's too many open loops or not useful open loops, then we're sort of waiting. We need ending, we need completion. And so it is important to close loops that just leave people hanging uncomfortably. Like when a need is there for completion and ending, then we should eventually complete and end things. Which is why in hypnotic trances that utilize metaphor and stories within stories via multiple embedded metaphors, we lead the client in. And often in hypnotic trance metaphors, there's either steps going down into something, or there's a path into a forest, and you ought to lead the client back up those steps or back out along that path in exactly the same way they went in. Because otherwise that's one of those uncomfortable, like you haven't closed it, and they leave extremely floaty and ungrounded. They haven't come back to starting point. And where do you leave them? Somewhere between middle of nowhere. And so that's one of those situations where you close those loops. So we leave open the ones that create innocent curiosity, close the ones that leave the client ungrounded. Okay. So he knew he'd come to the right place. Because it sounded as if that laughter was indeed coming from the center of the meadow. And something started to awaken inside him. Something started to come alive. There was a sense of certainty about what was about to happen. Could he finally be on the brink of finding out the true secret to everlasting happiness, which he so desperately wanted to know? And so our desperate seeker made his way to the middle of the meadow, where there was indeed a man. And the man was indeed laughing, with a real sincere, deep laughter. It sounded very happy. So the man who had been journeying for years approached the laughing man and said, "Are you by any chance the happiest man in the world? To which the happy man replied, yes, that is I. I am the happiest man in the world. Then please, pleaded our desperate seeker, please, may I have your shirt? I have been on a pilgrimage for years to find you. And my task, as given to me by a great healer, is to ask of your shirt and to put it on, for then and only then will I know the kind of happiness that you experience. To which the happiest man began to laugh even louder. In fact, he fell to the ground, holding his belly. He was laughing in hysterics. Our desperate seeker became a little bit astonished and concerned and said, why are you carrying on like that? Is there something wrong with you? And the happiest man said, well, perhaps there is. But if you'd had any sense of observation, you'd have noticed that I don't wear a shirt. In fact, I don't even own one. Our desperate seeker became most disturbed, worried, anxious, and scared. Well, what am I going to do now? And with that, the happiest man removed a hat that had been hiding his face. And as he took it off, he revealed himself as none other than the great healer who had originally sent our seeker on his journey. And of course, the seeker was alarmed, shocked, horrified. But it's you! You are the happiest man in the world. Are you even the happiest man in the world? Why didn't you just tell me all of this before I've been on the road for years? He said, that's right. So you could have just told me what the secret to happiness was when I first came to see you. No, I couldn't. Because you needed to take this journey. You needed to meet all the people that you met along the way. You needed to have the experiences that you've had. You've needed to discover all the parts of you and bring them into who you are through the experiences you've had. And most importantly, you needed to find out for yourself, as I think you now are, that happiness and sadness are interconnected sides of the same coin.